According to the assignment instruction for the first assignment, we are meant to have some basic collision detection in place and some sound effects before I hand this off to you to make your own game out of the shared code base. So next step, now that we have enemies, players, and the core loop in place, is to go get some collision happening. Now, we have one entity list containing background objects, enemies, and our player. We could separate these out so that we had one list for background objects, one for entities we care to collide with, and probably keep the player in a separate list entirely. But because I'm lazy and I don't want to repeat these lines of code 3 times in render, update, and input, I am going to separate the player from the list, but keep the background objects and the enemies in the same list, and instead, when I do collision detection, where I need to separate these things, we will use star count as our starting index. So the first, in this case, 40 items in the entities list are from the background. We don't care about those. So by writing a loop like this, but starting from star count, we can avoid collision detection with the base, with the star objects. So let me just, there we go, format. That's Control-Alt-L if you want to auto-format your code so it looks neat. So let's create a member to hold our player entity. I'll make that private for now because no one should be reaching into the player. I'm just going to call it player. Set it to null. You cannot instantiate it here because we need the game reference to exist before any entity is created. Then we can set... Oh, sorry, that should be player, of course. Player to a new player. And with that, we can copy this, bring it down to our update, or wherever we want to run collision testing. Might as well do it here. So first, we move all objects. So that includes, now that the player is separated, we have to update our player. And just to be inconsistent here, I'm going to do that before I update anything else, because they might be reading values from the player class. Remember, we have our player speed here, for example. So we'll let the player update first, then we move everything else, then we check for collisions, and if we need to react to collisions, we can do that as well. And lastly, we render, right? So that's the order we want things to happen. Speaking of the input, update, and render methods, I realize now that we've gotten quite far into the game and we're still not using the input, and we're not going to, because we have our input from an event from another thread, and there is no way to sort of bring that into our core loop in any reasonable manner, right? We are just receiving that event, checking a flag, or rather setting a flag, and then letting the game read that out when it needs to. So we can, in fact, remove input from our core loop. And that's fine, right? We're not dogmatic about any of this. We'll see how the next game fares when we have a more proper controller class. Maybe the input comes back. We'll see. So we update everything. Then we want to step through the entity list from star count up to entity size, I guess. Or is it entity's length? Size. Right. I don't want to create a temporary every time we spin through the loop, so I'm going to declare a temp entity out here that I can reuse for every collision check. So temp equals grab the entity we are currently accessing, and then we want to run our test. So if our player is colliding with the temp, then we want to notify both entities that they are involved in a collision. On collision with temp, and we do the same thing for temp about player. Does that make sense? So spin through all the live enemies, that is, we're starting from star count. We might actually have to comment this to clarify. Is background objects, background entities. So that the next guy or girl who comes through here reading our source code isn't wondering what the hell is going on. Again, if you want to separate the list, feel free to do that. If you have another method, maybe like you can give each entity a layer to render to, for example. That's a common strategy. And by having them in different layers, then you could do collision detection on the same layer only. That's a pretty neat solution. Now, if the player is taking damage, is not yet, we haven't implemented it, but if he is, we need to check if it's time to set game over, for example. So we can check if player health is less than 0, set game over to true. We don't have a game over yet, so let's see, alt insert. Nope, that's not what I want. I want to refactor, extract a field, private boolean game over. That works well. I'm just going to scroll up real quick and make sure that it defaults to false. So now we have a game over. If the game is game over, we don't want entities to keep moving. We still want to render, probably. So at the top of update, we're just going to check. If we are game over, return. Does that make sense? We can see if it works. Actually, we're not setting any health on the player yet. So let's go to the player class. Make sure that we have an on collision. We do indeed. And all I want to do here is health minus minus. We should probably also add a note, because we are running 60 frames per second. If you're colliding once, you are likely to be colliding many, many times over a very short amount of time. So we should allow the player a grace period. It's called recovery frames. So that when you've taken damage, make the player invincible for a short time, so we don't run out of lives immediately up on the first collision. That's probably going to be part of your assignment. So implement recovery frames, temporary immortality, after taking damage. We might also, if we want to be fancy about this, do a collision separation, but I think I'm going to be lazy and just kill whatever object was colliding with me. In this case, I know I'm the player, so I don't have to do anything, but from the enemy type, we can override on collision. So that's alt insert, override on collision, and when this happens, I can basically take this ship and respawn it. So that would be something similar to this line of code. But we have now repeated that line of code 3 times. We have it in the constructor, we have it in the updates, and we have it in on collision. We should probably move that into a separate function. And I'm thinking we're going to have to do that anyway, because now that we have a game over condition, the game will actually stop running. We will need a way to restart it. And that restart method might be a good place to put the spawn code as well, so that we can sort of spawn and respawn entities however many times we want from the same instance. Let's see if this collision code works. Well, I'm seemingly not on screen, and also, oh, there we go. 3 collisions. The game stopped. We're not updating anymore. Question is why the player isn't rendering. Because I haven't added it. So in the update, I call player update before I update anything else. In render, I will do it the opposite way. I want the player to always be on top of everything else, in this game anyway. So we simply copy that, render the player, apply those changes. How much time have we spent? 9 minutes. All right, fair enough. So that's 4 collisions, right? We need to be below 0 before we die. So this is game over. We need a way to restart, and we probably also need a way to write out the number of lives and how fast we're moving. We need a way of keeping score and stuff like this. So question is, do we do render the HUD first, or do we do restarting? Let's try restarting. So on touch event, we could do it on the finger down action, but in general, when you're reacting to button presses, you want to do it on the action up. so that the player can change their mind. If you have a button, you put your mouse down on it. If you pull it off the button before releasing, you don't want to take the action, right? That's the sort of general strategy anyway. So strive to take the action when they release the button, not when they press it down. So in this case, on action up, if we are game over, we need to restart somehow. Restart game, start game. Let's call it start game for now. No, let's call it restart. I'm not sure. We'll change our mind. We need to create that method, so I'm gonna just put it up by the constructor, because I'm thinking a lot of that code is going to be moved in here. So we make this private. It should return void. And then everything we're doing here, that's fine, that's fine. These have been added. So all I want to do is spin through them and make sure they are reset. All right, so I'm gonna grab the entity list, spin through our entities and let's call them respawn or reset, whatever you want. Let's respawn the player. This means I should probably have a respawn method in our base class. Is there anything else that needs to be reset? Player health will be reset by the player himself or herself. Game over should be reset. Equals false. So this should be the only place where that happens. Which means we can actually stop our update loop now, so the game won't be running until we're ready to start. Hang on, no, I'm lying. I'm being stupid. Actually, maybe. Let's do it this way, so the game will be paused effectively until we touch the screen. That might be a quick fix. Right, go to entity, add this into the base class. So entity, we have an update, blah, 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 blah. We have a void. Sorry, can zoom in here. What did I call it? Respawn. Don't need to close that. Then we can go to the player to start with resetting her. Make sure that's an override. We don't want to load the bitmap. We just want to set X to start position. And now I want to make sure that I call respawn from this place. And I want to set my health to the correct health. And now I am going to make that an actual setting. Well, it's not an actual setting until you move it out to settings, but let's call this starting health. Make that 3. And in my respawn, set that to starting health. We should also probably make sure we zero out our velocities so we're not still running at full speed. Is that the velocity I care about? Yes. Velocity Y as well. Something like that. You probably want to set the Y velocity, but let's move on. I'm going to copy this into the enemy. The enemy has loaded a bitmap. It has been flipped. So all I want is basically this positioning code. Move that into the player. This puts it off the screen at random height with velocity zeroed out, which makes no sense because we're going to set the velocity as soon as we update anyway. But what we want to call here is respawn. I think that's all we need. Might be wrong, but let's try running this and see where we are. We definitely want to give some information to the player at this point, so HUD is sorely lacking. If the player isn't aware of what's going on, then the game is garbage. So the game didn't start until I touched the screen. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, neat. That worked. Hang on. So we are dead. I click, I release. It starts over. It's a bit clumsy with the way the ships respawn, but I can live with that. And we might actually want to respawn the stars as well to create an entirely new star field, like visibly restarting the game. This is a good start for that functionality though. So I'm going to leave you here, and then we come back and look at HUD or audio. See you soon.